We will now proceed with our first panel on a comparative analysis of non-violent ethnic hostilities in Asia-Pacific. This panel seeks to spotlight the common causes of non-violent ethnic hostilities, which may include factors such as the threat of limited access to resources, lack of social trust, government dissatisfaction, and contagion effects from tensions in neighboring countries. In particular, the panel will address the roles of race-based hate rhetoric and political leaders in exacerbating intergroup hostility. Panelists will also discuss what can facilitate the escalation of non-violent ethnic hostilities and explore why ethnic tensions in some countries have remained largely non-violent in relation to others. I would now like to invite our first speaker, Professor Joseph Liao, Tankaki Chair in Comparative and International Politics and Dean of the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences at Nanyang Technological University, to give his speech. Professor Liao, please.
Thank you. Very good morning, everyone. Great pleasure and privilege to be here with all of you this morning. Thank you to IPS, to Matthew for the invitation. So to kickstart the conference, I mean, we had ministers setting the stage. Now we move into the conference proper to kickstart the first panel. I'm going to do three things. First, I'll just provide a very quick survey of inter-ethnic tensions, primarily in Indonesia and Malaysia, but I will sort of venture into some other Southeast Asian countries as well, just to give us some context. Second, I will share some thoughts on how, in the case of Indonesia and Malaysia, the state has managed the different aspects of inter-ethnic relations, in the process trying to put a lid on the potential for the spillover to conflict and violence. And thirdly, I will consider some of the underlying issues that percolate beneath the surface in both societies and that continue to render the risk of inter-ethnic hostility very real, with the potential for spillover to violence. Now, I think those of us who are familiar with the history of Southeast Asia, you will know that ethnic identity very much lies at the heart of nation and state building in Southeast Asia. It is a part of the historical narrative in practically every Southeast Asian country. One important aspect of ethnic identity that we can glean from this history is how it is multi-dimensional, how it is interactive, and how for any given ethnic group, it is often also understood in relation to other ethnic groups and other identities. Also, ethnic boundaries exist most vividly when there are presumed contacts with other groups and identities. In this manner, ethnic identity is frequently recognized and expressed in relation to others. And I think Minister touched on this a little bit already in his speech. So for example, how indigenous Southeast Asian communities relate to ethnic Chinese immigrant communities, the narrative of ethnic Thai, and how they have constructed the Malays in the southern provinces, for example, or the Karen in the northeast. The narratives of fragmentation, which has unfortunately become very much a feature of Myanmar's post-colonial history. So these are some examples of this dynamic at play. Often such interactions can become confrontational, right? As expressed in the notion of ethnic conflicts, ethnic violence, ethnic discrimination, ethnic cleansing, ethnic war, the nomenclature goes on. I think it is important to note that ethnic differences themselves do not cause the conflict, but when differences are politicized or become a point of contention for resource allocation, for example, or even at the provocation of external parties, they can become issues of contention. So by way of these opening points, what is the story of ethnic identity, politics, and conflict in Indonesia and Malaysia? In the remaining 10 minutes, let me get into that. And let me start perhaps on a slightly more positive note. We look at Indonesia. Given the ethnic tapestry of the country, the diversity, the very complex and troubled history that frames it, it is, to some extent, remarkable that how Indonesia had not been torn asunder by ethnic conflict, and how comparative little violence was seen in the transition from authoritarian rule to democracy, especially after the fall of the Suharto New Order government during the Asian financial crisis. Now, in case you think that this is an exaggeration, you remember two particular episodes in Indonesian history. The first is the Indonesian Revolution itself, 1945 to 1949, and the violence, the extensive ethnic violence that was a dominant feature of that period. Number two, the events of Gestapo and the immediate aftermath. This is the communist and anti-communist movements, 1965 roughly to 1966, 1967. Again, defined by excessive violence, predominantly against the ethnic Chinese community. Now, I'm not saying that there was no violence. Yeah, there have been at least 4 phases of political violence in Indonesia since the fall of Suharto. Number one, attacks on ethnic Chinese at the height of the financial crisis. Number two, outbreak of violence in the late 1990s in Kalimantan between ethnic Dayak and Maduris, and later Malays and Maduris. Number three, interreligious violence that unfolded primarily in Sulawesi and Maluku, 1999 to 2002. And number four, terrorist attacks across the archipelago perpetrated by Jemaah Islamiyah and its splinter groups. There was also the long-standing issue, as those of you familiar with Indonesia will know, of Aceh, which was resolved in 2005, 2006. There was East Timor, and there was Papua as well. But the point is, in hindsight, inter-ethnic violence was to large extent contained, and the balkanization of Indonesia never quite came close to materializing. Violence against Chinese and the violence in Kalimantan was quickly contained. The inter-religious pogroms petered out by 2002 and have not really recurred in any major way in subsequent years. Terrorism has been brought under control by effective counter-terrorism strategies. Timor secured its independence. Aceh, by and large, successful autonomy arrangements. Papua, by and large, not so successful autonomy arrangements. What about Malaysia? Historically, during the heights of racial tensions, quite a few commentators of that day feared that Malaya and later Malaysia were also at risk of faltering as a peaceful multi-ethnic country. Yet the Malaysian polity survived tremendous inter-ethnic challenges. The basically Chinese-based communist insurgency, which was eventually put down in the early 1960s and ended in 1989. The integration of Malaya with the ethnically different British Borneo territories of Sabah and Sarawak, and of course Singapore in 1963. The separation of Singapore from Malaysia in 1965. The confrontasi policy engineered by Indonesia from 63 to 67. The emergency law period between 69 and 71 in the wake of inter-ethnic riots in KL, to name a few. The outbreak of inter-ethnic violence with the exception, was the exception to the rule of peaceful negotiated settlements. In fact, aside from the riots of 1969, inter-ethnic tensions have not really spilled over to violence. The only other major instance of political violence, perhaps in post-colonial Malaysian history, was in 1985, the Mamali incident, but that was a very different kind of conflict. So what does this historical record tell us about inter-ethnic relations and potential for hostilities in Indonesia and Malaysia? Let me start by saying what it does not tell us. The conclusion that should not be drawn from this brief survey is that hostility between ethnic groups on grounds of ethnic identity is not a serious matter for these countries. It is a serious matter precisely because of some very fundamental dynamics at play, which I will talk about in a bit. But first, let's consider the second part, the question of why and how Indonesia and Malaysia managed to avert the outbreak of severe ethnic conflict. Let me say a few things about Indonesia first, and I would propose that three things stand out. There may be more, but in the interest of time, let me identify three. The first is decentralization. The transition from the New Order to the post-New Order period, as we know, essentially began under the presidency of B.J. Habibie. Yeah? As president at that time of the transition, I think Habibie put in place or took some decisions that, in hindsight, had a very major impact on this issue of the management of inter-ethnic relations in Indonesia. Primarily, instead of clamping down in the manner of the New Order, Habibie responded to secessionist ambitions by quickly devolving political authority and fiscal resources, allowing one of the most thoroughgoing and rapid decentralization processes ever recorded in the history of democratization. And this decentralization cannot be overestimated, given the underlying given how one of the underlying features of Indonesian history and politics has been the tension between the Javanese center and the provincial identities surrounding it, which, by the way, is still it's still in existence today. Second, the development of a culture and practice of inter-ethnic political coalitions as a key feature of democratic consolidation. This was predicated on understanding that unless candidates can broaden their support base, which requires them to broaden their appeal and their reach, they will not win. As such, candidates have to consider the interests and needs of other ethnic constituencies, make themselves visible to them, responsive to them, in order to seek the support of different ethnic associations. This is not to say that ethnicity no longer matters. In fact, there are many studies that show that Indonesians still vote along ethnic lines in the era of democracy. But the thing is this, under these conditions, electoral competition is taking place in the context of ethnic coalition building and compromise, and not ethnic outbidding and competition. And number three, the banning of local and regional political parties. In Indonesia, only political parties that have a broad national presence are eligible to run in elections. Local parties are not allowed, with the exception of Aceh. This makes it very difficult for ethnic parties, which are often local in nature, to establish a foothold. Now let me move on to Malaysia. In the case of Malaysia, a political structure predicated on power sharing in ethnically divided Malaysia was put in place at independence and has prevailed over a long time. This is the Malaysian model of consociational democracy, as they call it. This political structure, in turn, was premised on two features. First, a social contract, where minorities recognize the so-called special position of the majority Malay Muslim community in return for the majority's recognition of minorities' legitimate interests. Second, the operation of multi-ethnic coalition politics. Coalitions must generally draw on ethnic parties representing a range of minorities in order to gain a majority in elections, with some tweaking and rebalancing along the way, such as in the aftermath of May 1969, when the alliance evolved into the Barisan Nasional. This structure has held the peace. Having said that, its long accepted norms of citizenship, rights, political representation are being challenged today. I'll point out at least two dynamics that have worked to undermine it. On the one hand, you have a situation, I would argue, since Mahathir 1.0, right, 1981, where the power equation within the Barisan has shifted in a way that has tilted predominantly to the Malays at the expense of the non-Malays. On the other hand, you have a party like PKR today, Anwar's party, that is trying very hard to project itself as a multi-ethnic party. And then you have the DAP, the Democratic Action Party, that is trying to demonstrate that it is an equal partner of equal standing with the dominant Malay parties, which is very important because in the past, one of the problems with the MCA, with the MIC, was the belief that they were essentially, if I may put it this way, beaten into submission by the Mahathir-led UMNO. Now, let me come to the final part of my presentation in the 26 seconds left that I have. Notwithstanding the presence of structural, institutional, and political tools through which ethnic differences are managed and balanced as a way to head off conflict and violence, there are a number of fundamental issues at play that still render the threat of inter-ethnic hostility very real in these societies. Narratives of difference, division, marginalization still remain. And here I wish to focus primarily on the role of religion and more specifically religious identity and politicking. In the case of Indonesia, we have witnessed how inter-ethnic tension in the country has shifted to a religious register in the last roughly a quarter of a century. And several things are worth bearing in mind. First, the nature and threat posed by the targets of violence as perceived by the indigenous community. The riots of the late 1990s reflected in part a response to the continued entrenchment and advantages of Chinese capital and Christian professionals in Indonesian society. These socioeconomic conditions created a cast of mind in many segments of indigenous society and were readily and easily leveraged by conflict entrepreneurs, including rival networks of politicians, civil servants, businessmen, retired and active police and military officers to advance various agendas, including local agendas. Yeah? One good example, relatively recently, in 2016, the mass mobilization against the Christian ethnic Chinese deputy governor at that time, Ahok of Jakarta. Number two, inter-ethnic and intra-religious insecurities. Beyond the scapegoating or external threat perception, another threat emerged to prompt various groups to engage in vigilante-style enforcement of religious morality, leading to the persecution of religious deviants in Indonesia. Here, what is worth noting to me is the difficulties of these Islamist groups themselves to maintain internal discipline, cohesion, and faith among their own ranks, much less in overcoming the tendency towards factionalism and fragmentation across a host of Islamist organizations, competing for media attention and for authority and recognition in their community. Third, the assertion of religious identity and authority. Here, I'm thinking about the ways in which campaigns to police religious morality and to persecute religious deviants have emerged with encouragement and support from Islamist parties represented in local legislatures and among local executives, and also in the national parliament, and if I may say so, in the cabinet of the day as well. In the case of Malaysia, the overlay, especially of religion on ethnic politics, has become more and more acute in recent times. In Malaysia, fault lines have formed over the issue of what it means to be a member of the Malaysian nation, according to the official narrative of nationhood, and how this narrative has evolved as historical pluralist conceptions are being supplanted by a religious discourse that seeks to reconceptualize nationhood along narrow and exclusivist terms. Specifically, it has taken the form of a dominant and domineering narrative of supremacy and exclusion defined by religious vocabulary that is harnessed to reinforce, express, and institutionalize a narrow conception of what they call Ketuanan Melayu, the lordship of the Malays. Consequently, while an idea of a Malaysian identity may exist, the hierarchical nature of the Malaysian socio-political structure, where power is essentially held in the hands of the Malay Muslim elite, and the dominant yet profoundly narrow narrative of nationhood they promulgate, cannot but weaken any effort at building that identity. Now let me conclude with some final remarks. So Indonesia and Malaysia are ethnically very diverse societies. This diversity, of course, has been a very rich reservoir of cultural and societal strength, but also can generate destabilizing dynamics which have to be managed. In fact, they have done that. Both have had complex histories of conflict and violence between ethnic groups, which have required much effort to manage and contain. While both states have, by and large, if you look at the situation today, managed this successfully, managed to spill over to violence successfully through constitutional, institutional, procedural, and security instruments, there remains deep undercurrents that still exist today. And as such, their respective political cultures and structures will need to continue to be sensitive to the dynamics of inter-ethnic relations in their specific socio-political, economic, and cultural environments. Levers of state power to manage ethnic relations are vital tools, but they are really only part of the story. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Liao. Now, please welcome our second speaker, Professor Yuko Kawai, from the College of Intercultural Communication, Graduate School of Intercultural Communication at Rikyo University, on stage for her speech. Professor Kawai, please.
Thank you for inviting me for this very important forum today. Before attending this conference, I had to fill in this form. Then I came to the race question, and I realized, oh, that's how race works in Singapore. You have to choose from the choices of Caucasian, Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others. And of course, I chose others, right? And different country has different race system. Different countries have different race systems. On the right side, on the left side, it is the U.S. Census form, and on the right side, that is 2021 England Census form. And each form have similar choices such as white, black, and Asian, but their question is different. U.S. Census form's question is, what is the person's race? And the England Census forms asks you, what is your ethnic group? And Japan has totally different system. Japan's census does not have any race or ethnicity question, but there is only one question, that is nationality. So you choose either Japan or foreign country, and you identify the name of the country of your nationality. According to the latest data, the population of foreign residents in Japan is like this. The first largest group in Japan is from China, and followed by Vietnam, South Korea, Philippines, and Brazil, Nepal, Indonesia, Myanmar, Taiwan, and the United States. And this data does not include ethnic minorities with Japanese citizenship or mixed race Japanese people. So actually in Japan we have different kinds of ethnic minority groups, including like Ainu people, indigenous group in Japan, living mostly in the northern part of Japan, and also Okinawans, who used to have an independent kingdom before the annexation before being annexed by colonized by Japan. So and also mixed race people are not included. So we actually don't know how much or how many of the Japanese population has actually ethnic background. And in this presentation, what I mean by racism is this. it's an expression of racially predicated or manifested social and political relations of domination, subordination, and privilege. And this definition has three key elements. The first is expression. Racism is expressed in different forms, and it has to do with the concept of race, and it involves power relations. So racism looks like this. This is based on a study by Gorash-Bosa 2016, and I slightly modified this chart. So racism has two dimensions: ideological, which means meaning or symbolic dimension, and structural or material dimension. For example, the concept of race is a macro example of the ideological dimension. And the concept of race is collectively or socially constructed. And people, based on the concept of race, people construct their identities, or may have prejudice or stereotype against other groups. And the concept of race is materialized in social policies or laws or institutional behaviors, such as racial profiling by the police, or individual acts also may be influenced by the concept of race. Sometimes individual people may commit some hate speech or hate crimes based on the concept of race. So the two dimensions, ideological and structural dimensions, are influencing each other. They are not separated from each other, but are connected. And also, macro and micro behaviors are also interconnected. So those two dimensions, or those two macro-micro behaviors are forming a kind of loop like this. Sorry for the long introduction. So today I'm going to talk about these three things. First, I'm going to talk about Japanese concept of race. And next, I would like to point out two problems about racism in Japan. And lastly, I am going to introduce racism against, especially focusing on mixed race Japanese. There are many examples, but for the sake of time, I just focus on racism against mixed race Japanese. So as you saw in the US and the UK, the England census form, race and ethnicity can be used interchangeably. According to Bolivar 1991, he says the core or central idea of race is the schema of genealogy, which means that a group is imagined like a big family, right? And in which cultural or biological traits are transmitted for generations. So even if a group is categorized based on cultural differences, still if a culture is essentialized, which means culture is portrayed as something pure, something that only members of the group can properly acquire, then that culture group is going to become a racialized group or racial group. So Japan has two concepts of race. The first one is called jinshu, and it was a Japanese translation of Western concept of race, which was imported to Japan by the mid-19th century from European and American books. And in this idea of race, in the concept of race, Japanese people were summarized with other Asian peoples as an inferior race, like the yellow race or Asian or Orientals. So this is an example of how jinshu was described or discussed in the mid-19th century. This book was written by Fukuzawa Yukichi. Actually, his face is on the largest Japanese banknote, 10,000 yen. So he's one of the very famous Japanese Enlightenment thinkers. So he introduced Blumenbach's 5 categories of race in a very small book targeting the general public. And he says, he wrote, white race are beautiful, most civilized, and most superior race. On the other hand, The yellow race are less talented and progress, of course, than the white race. And the black race are lazy and the least progress, right? So at that time, this is the knowledge. This is the knowledge. It's not about prejudice, it's the knowledge. That's what is taken, as knowledge. And second, Japanese concept of race is minzoku. This is a newer word, and the purpose of this new concept is to differentiate the Japanese from other Asians, but at the same time, trying to retain the core idea of race. Because phenotypically, or in appearance, Japanese people and other Asian people look similar. There's no difference between them. So they try to use culture and essentialize the culture and try to differentiate the Japanese from other Asian groups. So Japanese people are imagined as people with 3 unities of language, culture, and nation, which means that if you are Japanese, you have to speak the language like very fluently and very familiar. You have to be familiar with Japanese culture. And most importantly, you have to be born to 2 Japanese parents. So this is an these are examples of how minzoku, the concept of minzoku, were discussed in the late 19th century. And Japanese people, as you can see, Japanese language was Japanese language was imagined like a biological trait, a spiritual blood for the Japanese, and the Japanese national character is sustained by this spiritual blood. And also, at that time, the emperor played a very important role. So Japanese people were viewed as a big family with the emperor as their father, their common father. So Nihonjin, actually, after World War II, Japanese people no longer use the term minzoku. We don't call ourselves the Japanese minzoku or Yamato minzoku, but instead we just called ourselves Nihonjin. But still, after the end of World War II, Japan changed from multi-minzoku or multi-racial ethnic empire to a single minzoku nation or single racial ethnic nation. And this phrase, Taitsu minzoku, or a single ethnic or single minzoku nation, is still very popular. People often use this term. And even though we don't call ourselves Japanese minzoku, but still in the term Nihonjin or the Japanese, the meaning of the minzoku still remained in this idea of Nihonjin after World War II. But one big change is that the role of the emperor became rather invisible. Here, I would like to point out 2 problems about racism in Japan. Racism in Japanese is translated as jinshu-shugi. Jinshu-shugi or racism in Japanese is a completely negative term. But however, minzoku-shugi, or which can be translated into English as nationalism or ethno-nationalism, this is not completely negative. So when you ask Japanese people about racism, people often think racism is about white-black racism or white-yellow racism, but they don't consider Japanese racism against other Asian people as racism. And as you can see in Article 14 in the Constitution of Japan, well, this is an anti-discrimination article in Japanese Constitution. And it says no discrimination is allowed based on race, creed, sex, social status, family origin. But race in Japanese is just the term jinshu. It doesn't include the term minzoku. And the second problem is that because of the dominant, the popular phrase, Taitsu minzoku, or Japan is a single racial ethnic nation, Racism, people often see racism not an important domestic issue, because if only Japanese people are living in Japan, racism cannot become a big social issue. So sometimes people think, well, racism is an American problem or foreign countries' problem, not Japanese, Japan's problem. So that's another problem. So racism has not been studied so much in Japan because people do not consider racism as an important social issue. And lastly, I would like to introduce racism, nonviolent hostilities against mixed-race Japanese. A common issue is that because they are viewed as deviated from the dominant meaning of the Japanese, which means you have to speak the language fluently, practice the culture, fluently, and also you have to have 2 Japanese parents, right? But mixed-race Japanese people, they are deviated from that. Even if they are born in Japan, they speak the language fluently, their most familiar culture is Japanese culture, but still, they are often considered as not fully Japanese. Even in Japanese, we have the term called hafu. This is a loan word from English, half. Why half? Because half, it's not fully Japanese, like it's half. And you can see 2 pictures. The upper picture, her father is from Ghana, and her mother is Japanese. And the lower picture, her father is Indian, and her father is Japanese. And they are represented. They are chosen as the representative of Miss Universe and Miss World Japan. When they are chosen as a representative of this beauty contest, online comments were like, they don't look like Japanese. Why do they represent Japan? That kind of comment was rampant. Right? These are common issues, but they face or they experience different racism based on the concept of race, because as I told you, Japan has 2 concepts of race. So there is a racial hierarchy. Right? White Japanese mixed people are usually considered as more beautiful, global than non-mixed Japanese, and also non-white mixed Japanese people. And next, depending on your visibility of your mixedness, their experience is slightly different. So if you are visible mixed race Japanese, Japanese people often think that they are not Japanese. So sometimes they face racial profiling by the police. And also, let me introduce one example from my past research. I interviewed one person whose parent is from Sri Lanka, and his mother is Japanese. His father has a restaurant in Japan. And sometimes he, helps his father's restaurant. And when he's, working in that restaurant, Japanese people, often tell him, "Oh, you speak, good Japanese. Why do you speak Japanese so fluently?" Of course, he was born in Japan, and the only language he can speak is Japanese. So when he has time, he just explains, "Oh, I was born in Japan, and my father is Sri Lankan, and my mother is Japanese." But when he is too busy, when there are many customers in the restaurant, he don't have time, so he just pretends that he's a foreigner, and he used accented Japanese and say, "Just thank you." and another thing, this is the last point, sorry, time is up. But when you are a mixed Japanese people with East Asian or Southeast Asian parents, sometimes their mixedness are not acknowledged. They are treated as Japanese or non-Japanese, often based on father's nationality. Because in Japan, married couples have to have the same family name. And legally, you can choose either husband's name or wife's name, but more than 98% of the married couples choose husband's name. So your father's name is Japanese name. Sometimes they are students in my, in my courses that I assume that because they have Japanese family name, I assume they are Japanese. But I sometimes, become surprised when I read their final paper. Oh, my mother is from the Philippines. My mother is from China. Right? But these people are not, we are not sure how many of them are actually living in Japan because we don't have the data. Okay, thank you so much. If you have any questions, please ask me in Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kawai. Our third speaker for the panel, Dr. Jonathan Ben, from the Institute of Migration Studies at Comillas Pontifical University, will now give his speech. Dr. Ben, please.
Thank you, everyone. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity, to the IPS especially for inviting me and all the hard work making this happen, and to everyone here for attending today. And in my 15 minutes, I'm going to give us a brief overview of racism in Australia and of anti-racism efforts and challenges. Now, before I start, I want to acknowledge that much of the work that I'll be presenting has been the fruit of strong collaborations with colleagues at both Deakin University, Western Sydney University, and the Centre for Resilient and Inclusive Societies in Australia. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands we now call Australia, their ongoing struggles in the face of racism, and to remind us that sovereignty over these lands has never been ceded. And so now let us talk about racism. And racism, as Yuko has also told us, can be defined as a system of oppression that creates hierarchies between groups based on characteristics like race, ethnicity, and religion. These hierarchies work to disadvantage some groups and advantage others. When we think about racism, often we think about violence that is physical and blatant. And for example, in Australia, we may think of massacres committed against indigenous peoples, about historical lynching against Asian migrants, or about the Cronulla race riots of 2005, as in these pictures here behind me, where thousands gathered to claim their beach from outsiders, as they put it, and attacked people of Middle Eastern appearance. We may also think about things like hate crimes, attacks on public transport, vandalism, or threats of violence. And violence is indeed a critical element of racism in Australia and has been throughout history. But physical violence is quite uncommon compared to other forms of racism. Instead, racism in Australia often doesn't look like much, or may look more like this: a boring employment form where one's name may be the sole basis for discrimination. Such racism is often subtle or seems hidden, where you may not know that you're being discriminated against. But it can have major consequences, of course, in blocking access to resources like jobs, in this case. Now, nonviolent racism can be interpersonal, as in, for example, verbal expressions like jokes or name-calling, exclusion, like avoiding or ignoring someone, in disrespect or distrust, or in rejecting people based on their religious or national background, for example, as threatening, criminal, or not fitting in, which has become quite common these days. And we may also use terms like casual racism or microaggressions, as some of the speakers before me have also noted, to describe incidents that happen every day and may appear small and unproblematic. Still, in recent years, more attention is given to institutional and structural forms of racism, including practices, rules, and policies. They exist, for example, in the housing market, financial institutions, and the sharing economy, in police racial profiling practices, or in unfair media coverage that portrays some groups in consistently negative ways. We can also see racism in other settings, for instance, online, in sports, like the Australian Football League, where it's been widely investigated recently, or at schools. And I'll now elaborate just a little bit more about the nature of racism in Australia. So a few points here. And first of all, racism is historically entrenched. We have to keep that in mind. It can be traced to British settler colonial invasion starting in 1788. It has derived from colonial extraction, dispossession, and violence against indigenous peoples. Later on, it extended into discrimination and exclusion of different immigrant groups, for example, under the White Australia policy, where racism restricted non-white immigration. Today, Australia is highly culturally diverse, with multiculturalism as bipartisan policy. But racial hierarchies still persist, whiteness remains dominant, and white privilege is under-interrogated. A second point here is that racism takes on various forms towards different groups in Australia. As in these media images, we've seen, for example, the criminalization of African Australians by politicians and media as African gangs several years ago, and this has been a discourse that's been coming in and out of focus. Discrimination against Asian Australians and temporary migrants in the context of COVID-19, Islamophobia and the recurring targeting of Muslim Australians, and anti-Semitism against Jewish Australians. Meanwhile, colonization and oppression of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people continue and bear devastating consequences in all areas of life, including health inequalities, poverty, and deaths in custody. The targeting of specific groups happens episodically, often in times of crisis, real or perceived, and we see this time and again from wars to pandemics to panics about crime. Now, a third point is that racism in Australia is also quite prevalent, maybe quite differently to what we may think. A major national survey recently showed that 18% of adults throughout the country have experienced racism in the last 12 months. However, this rate rises to 39% for people from non-English speaking backgrounds, including 41% for Chinese Australians and 50% for Indian Australians. So that's quite high. In some studies, more than half of Indigenous peoples report experiencing racial discrimination. And in a couple of studies, the prevalence of verbal forms of racism was about twice that of physical forms, and rates of race-based disrespect were even higher. And finally, as I mentioned, racism is also impactful, affecting various areas of life, also more generally. Here we have this powerful quote from Ghassan Haj, one of the leading scholars on racism in Australia, about the nature of Australian racism as it can be experienced. And I'll quote, "Australian racism suffocates you slowly. You find yourself stuck in it and you don't know what hit you. You want to condemn it, but you don't know what to condemn because you don't know what has happened to you." This resonates with many experiences that I have come across as a researcher of racism as prevalent and suffocating, yet at the same time quite elusive, and something that many people still deny. And so the next question, and I'll move on to the second part of my presentation, it may ask what is being done in Australia right now about racism and for racial equality, and we have a few more minutes for that. So several things have been happening these last few years. There's been some momentum for anti-racism policy in practice, as well as increased discussion in the media and some more research being done. There has also been greater public awareness. For example, far more Australians now, 60% instead of 40%, report that they see racism as a problem. And these rates have risen since 2021 and remained steady since. So that's 3 out of 5 Australians. There are several new initiatives by policymakers and major organizations. For example, the Australian Human Rights Commission has been developing Australia's next anti-racism framework. And I won't be saying too much about this since we have the former Race Discrimination Commissioner with us here today who will be speaking later. There is also an important inquiry into injustices experienced by Indigenous peoples in Victoria, the state of Victoria. Then there are other initiatives at state levels, municipal levels, and smaller community and local initiatives and projects. And these range from protests to quaint art projects to various groups that exist online. Another sphere of anti-racism includes interventions. And some of the best known here are media and communications campaigns, like the Racism It Stops With Me national campaign and Indigenous X that exists online. There are training and education projects, including diversity training, awareness-raising programs, and bystander action programs. And there are also intergroup contact initiatives, such as interfaith dialogues. And finally, we see more research done on racism, which is important for raising public awareness and shaping anti-racism policies, initiatives, and action, and helping articulate experiences with racism. And my colleagues and I have done some projects towards these ends, which I can discuss later on when we get to the Q&A part. Happy to do that. And now let us look at some challenges to anti-racism. Still have 3 minutes to go. Here I will just introduce some major challenges that keep coming up in our work. So this is by no means a comprehensive list. The first challenge is quite obvious, but so important that I'll mention it anyway, where a lot of anti-racism work relies on short-term, insecure funding and can easily be affected by political changes from elections to personnel turnover, and I'm sure a lot of people in the room will be familiar with these. This isn't true only for large national or state initiatives, and we see the same in organizations where those with committed, actively involved leadership and long-term funding are more likely to succeed. Secondly, many Australians tend to deny, dismiss, or minimize racism, avoiding discussions of the ongoing significance of race or conflate mentions of race with racism. Third, and relatedly, there is a need for improved racial literacy and anti-racist education, a better understanding of racism also structurally, the ability to talk about human differences in an informed and respectful way, greater understanding of histories of colonization and dispossession, and of the legacies of white privilege. The need for better education becomes more urgent right now, given the rise in disinformation and fake news, and the amount of hate that is being circulated online. In terms of research, my colleagues and I have called for a coordinated national research agenda and data management plan. And another gap is the lack of ethnicity data, which has been debated quite a lot recently, and would be an important asset, especially in terms of measuring disparities between groups. Finally, there are challenges to formally reporting racism for reasons like lack of trust in agencies, seeing reporting as ineffective, or fears of retaliation. Reporting can be very burdensome, but often it offers very little in return to the people who make the reporting. There are also challenges to reporting more generally, such as limits to perceiving and recognizing racism, for example, by recent migrants. And for these reasons, there have been calls to better align reporting pathways and support services with the expectations and needs of those who actually experience racism. And I'll move on to my very last slide, where I want to go back to some of the panel's themes today, and 3 points here. So first of all, on the root causes of nonviolent racism in Australia. In part, nonviolent racism may keep evolving because violent racism is punishable and widely unacceptable socially also. So it appears that racism has taken other, but still effective ways to do its harms, just without the legal and social consequences. An important factor here may be the histories of particular institutions, their legal, social, and economic transformations, and the alternative methods or technologies, if we may, other than violence, that racism may exploit. At the same time, we need to be a bit cautious here about viewing Australian racism as largely non-violent. Sadly, racist violence in Australia has existed for a long time and doesn't seem to be going away. It seems that capacities for physical violence are still around, even if they usually remain under the surface. And this is an important point. But cruder forms of racism seem more ready to be reactivated than we might expect. And we got a painful reminder for this when COVID-19 broke out with a spike in blatant attacks against Asian Australians. Another important indication for what's going on under the surface are online environments where hate and verbal abuse are widespread. Here too, the forms and methods of racism keep mutating. We now have AI and algorithms do more and more of the discrimination. And finally, There are forms of violence that are not physical but critical for us to call out, understand, and address. And of course, this depends on what counts as violence and racism, which can vary across national and other contexts. So for example, inequitable social, political, or economic structures that work to disadvantage and oppress members of certain groups may be seen as structural violence, while we may see the resistance to recognize the knowledge and interests of Indigenous Australians as a form of epistemic violence. So, while we engage more with the harms of non-violent racism, it's important that we keep revising and revisiting our understanding of the shapes and boundaries of violence as well. And thank you very much. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Dr. Ben. We will now begin our Q&A session. Please approach the standing microphones if you would like to engage with our panel, and kindly identify yourself and your affiliation before asking your question. Alternatively, you can post your questions online by scanning the QR code on your tables with your mobile devices. This Q&A session will be moderated by Professor Barry Desker, Distinguished Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies and Nanyang Professor of Practice at Nanyang Technological University. I would now like to invite our speakers and chairperson for this panel to be seated on stage. Professor Desker, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Or I should say good morning, it's not yet 12 o'clock. We've had a very interesting discussion this morning. The panel has discussed a variety of issues. We in Singapore may wish to celebrate the retention of varied ethnic identities amidst the pressures to conform with a post-independence national identity. As such a variety adds color, promotes an inclusive identity, increases the scope for diversity, and encourages a broader vision of today's contemporary nation state. Nevertheless, I would say the political realist in me leads me to recognize that in this multi-ethnic mix, there is a risk that the prejudices which envelop the plural societies of the region could lead to periodic outbreaks of inter-ethnic violence and to an underlying series of non-violent hostilities and concerns. I think our panel is more equipped to answer the questions that you may have. But while I wait for someone to turn up at the microphones that we have, perhaps I could kick off the discussion by asking Joseph Liao a question. Although colonialism is often blamed for the presence of multiple identities and multiple ethnicities in contemporary Asia-Pacific states, why have non-violent ethnic hostilities sharpened in post-colonial independent states, sometimes even breaking out into violence?
Okay, thanks, Barry, for the question. Indeed, there is an element of the colonial legacy, so we shouldn't let them off the hook. But if we think about contemporary sort of political tensions between ethnic groups, I think a number of things we can point out. The first is in terms of the command of resources in various societies, right? And we see this in the underlying narrative of the role of ethnic Chinese communities in colonial and post-colonial societies in Southeast Asia. And those of us who are familiar with Indonesian, Malaysian history in particular, we are very aware of that. In a sense, it's quite unfair because it does caricature ethnic Chinese communities in these societies that are very diverse for a number of reasons, right? In terms of language, in terms of socioeconomic hierarchy. But there is this perception, right? There's always been this lingering perception that they command the lion's share of the economy at the expense of the indigenous communities. And that leads me to a second point, which is the role of political entrepreneurs, who very opportunistically leverage on this in order to enhance their standing with a narrative that they are protecting and advancing the interests of the indigenous communities. Yeah? So they engage deliberately, consciously, and unapologetically in narratives of difference and division. They're very proud of that. Yeah, and unfortunately, you have a situation where the state apparatus is not only struggling to contain that, partly because these political opportunists are part of the state apparatus, that there isn't the incentive and there isn't the interest and the political will to control it. Yeah? So I think the combination of these two factors have been quite pronounced in many Southeast Asian contexts.
Thank you. Perhaps if I could turn to you, Yuko, how do you see ethnic hostilities undermining or threatening multi-ethnic societies, even in a society like Japan, which sees itself as homogeneous? Does the influx of different ethnic groups, different nationalities, create a problem for Japan today?
Yes, but those problems about different people with different ethnic background, actually there are problems, but those problems are made invisible because because of the strong influence of the dominant idea of Japan as a single ethnic racial nation. There are problems. There are discrimination against those people, but those problems are not usually so much covered in the media, and those problems are not so much considered as an important social issue. So the existence of the problem does not lead to the coverage of the problem. So that's the problem, invisibility of the problem. The problem is there, but the problem was made invisible. That's the problem.
Is this problem of invisibility also something that is seen in Australia, Jonathan?
Yeah, very much so. I was just about to interject. I think the issue of data collection, what data do we actually have? How much are we willing to open up notions of race and racism also for investigation? That's an issue. And one thing I was talking about is the reporting rates that are quite low. We know that racism being underreported, and that's a challenge to how do we do that in a productive way? How do we encourage people to report racism? Assuring them that the authorities really care and that support services that are adequate are really there. And another issue there that is very similar to the ones that Yuko was describing in her talk was just about ethnicity and race data. So in Australia's case, it's more about ethnicity data, and we don't really have those data at the moment. It's quite challenging to collect them. The Australian Bureau of Statistics has actually had a fair few conversations about that before the upcoming census, and they're unable to put together a viable ethnicity variable. And that's a problem because we then don't really have a sense of the disparities that might be ethnicity-based. So, yeah,
You close, Jonathan, with comments on the rise of social media and its impact, including 24-hour news channels, instant communications, which have reinforced ethnic identities and increased the possibility of non-violent ethnic hostility. How valid is this for the Australian case? And if I may ask, the Japanese case as well. You go later.
Sure. So online hate speech that could then affect offline environments is a big issue, I think, worldwide. We had a couple of people also speak about this before we took the stage here. In Australia, like in other places. eSafety in Australia is an institution that is looking into these issues and trying to report on that and to keep matters in check. But it's very difficult because regulation is obviously low. And people can say and do say and post a lot of things out there that can trickle into action. And then the whole chain, and we spoke about this yesterday, the whole chain of actually proving that a certain statement or comment has led to violent incidents, that could be very hard to prove. So it's a point that people are still grappling with very much in Australia and other places.
Yeah, quite similar. In Japan, there are huge problems about online hate speech, but we don't have any clear regulations about, any laws or to regulate those hate speech, and even not even online, but on the street. Sometimes police protect people who are, who are demonstrating against ethnic Koreans or other people, other foreign residents, with a placard that kill those ethnic groups. That kind of, sometimes in Japan, that kind of demonstration was possible. Before 2016, then because of the rise of those so-called hate speech demonstration, the government introduced anti-hate speech prevention law, but it doesn't have any punishment. So it's kind of like it just just tell people don't do that. But if you do that, no consequences, right? So that's but still, it was very important to have this kind of law. But that is not enough. That's not enough.
Well, Joseph, my next question is to you. And for those who have been asking questions online, most of the questions have been on Malaysia and Indonesia. But I don't think I want this session to be a Malaysia-Indonesia session. So I shall pose one question to Joseph on the subject, but then return it to the broader issues which we are trying to cover. Joseph, where do we draw the line at religiosity and fundamentalism? Comparing countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, how do we counter such fundamentalism?
Oh. Okay, I think it's this. Let me start by saying that in both Indonesia and Malaysia, in fact, in a large part of the Muslim world, so to speak, this question of rising religiosity is a real issue. It's factual. There are a number of indicators we can look at, in terms of the importance of Islamic education, the importance of public norms of the expression of your religiosity, etc. Now, that is not to say that that is, in any way undermining any given society. Yeah, it's a more complex phenomenon than that. I'll give you an example. In Kelantan, in Malaysia, northern Malaysia, which is essentially run by PAS and has been run by PAS for a long time, will be run by PAS for a long time. If you talk to ethnic Chinese communities there, yeah, which constitute roughly about 15% of the population, there's no deep sense of insecurity. Yeah, if you talk to the Malay Muslim community there, the PAS people, there is no sense of deep insecurity. Why? Because actually it's very clear. PAS and Malay Muslims are dominant. They do not harbor the kind of concern for their place as the dominant group in society. But if you project out to the larger Western Malaysia, it becomes very different. Yeah, Malay Muslims are dominant demographically, but that dominance is not as significant as you find in the northern Malay states. Yeah, and how are some of these insecurities leveraged on and played out by the political entrepreneurs I talked about? They turn to religion. Yeah, they use religion in order to play it out. That's where we run into this problem where, if we talk about, I mentioned earlier, Ketuanan Melayu, right? About the sort of, if I may use the term, actually it's not an accurate translation, supremacy of the Malays. It's not supremacy, but that's the easy and somewhat lazy English translation of it. Yeah, it's actually become Ketuanan Agama, the dominance of religion, and Ketuanan Islam, the dominance of the Islamic religion in relation to Malaysian society. Yeah, so I think we need to understand how religiosity is leveraged by politics for certain purposes to advance certain ends. And you see that certainly in the Malaysian case, I will argue. You see that in the Indonesian case as well, but very acutely, I think, in Malaysia.
If there is anyone here who would like to ask a question, please proceed to one of the microphones. If I don't see anyone, I will then turn to the questions which are coming online. Jonathan, one of the questions is, in Australia, there is an acknowledgement of country to recognize indigenous lands. How is such an acknowledgement viewed in Australia? Is it seen as performative, or is it in fact a reminder of ethnic differences, or truly uniting?
That's a really good question. I wouldn't be able to say how it is viewed broadly. Like, I don't have the stats or the research on that. I can really speak about my impressions and the people that I've spoken with. Definitely, as a performative act, that is really significant for a lot of people. I know that in many events it can be quite brief in the beginning, but when you speak, especially to indigenous people who are present, it is something that matters a lot and goes a great deal in showing the kind of direction that that Australia has been taking, I think, for the last few decades. It's now been really stock of every event that I have been to. I don't think that it is seen, for my impression again, I don't think that it is seen as something that's stoking division or something that is pitching different groups against each other. I think it has this effect of bringing people together for a moment to acknowledge the shared histories of the place, and that we still really have a long way to go. Australians have a long way to go.
Yuko, two questions have been raised. One is, how is race, discrimination, multiculturalism taught in Japanese schools? The second one is, you've given a fascinating overview of the multiple facets of racism. Could you elaborate on the impact of racism on citizenship in Japan? How inclusive or exclusive is the attainment of citizenship in Japan?
So the first question was, can I see the question on the screen, please? Which one? Oh, yeah. Okay, so that's the second question, probably. Yeah. So in Japan, child's nationality is determined by the parent's nationality. So if you don't have a Japanese parent, you cannot have Japanese citizenship. Of course, there is a way to naturalizing. So some people stay in Japan for certain years and they get citizenship, but sometimes they are rejected based on, I'm not sure what kind of reason, but there are people who applied for citizenship and rejected. And also, before, those people who try to get Japanese citizenship are mostly people with Korean ethnic background. And these days, they are allowed to have ethnic names, but before, you have to have a Japanized names to get a citizenship. So you are, kind of, well, it's not a law, but you are strongly suggested, strongly recommended to have Japanized names. So that's another thing, because even if ethnic minorities get a Japanese citizenship, but they have to, in a way, hide their ethnic identities, then, Japan remains to be, a single racial ethnic nation on the surface. Of course, there are, actually they are not, right? So I think the racism in Japan, especially in contemporary Japan, I think it has to do with, it has strong connection with nationalism. So the intersection of racism, nationalism, and nationalism is kind of, legitimated in a way, right? So that's a difficult point. Because sometimes, well, this conference is about non-hostility, non-violent ethnic hostilities, but racism can be also expressed in a common sense, in a common-sensual way. It's just something taken for granted, right? So in order to, so going back to the first question about education about multiculturalism and racism in Japan, it has, it's usually compulsory education, national education is very nationalistic, right? You are taught the national language, you are taught national history, history based on your country's perspective, even though there are children with ethnic background, but those children do not have opportunities to learn history from their perspectives. So difficult things is the difficult point about changing or intervening Japan's situation is that yes, people say it's wrong. The racism is not good, but nationalism, it's quite difficult, because this world is still dominantly viewed as a collection of nation state. And the ideal or view of the world is that one nation is supposed to have one state. So that means you exclude other nations in the state. So how do we challenge this kind of worldview? The world is consisting of nation state, self-determination, national self-determination. That's important principle, but because of that important principle, sometimes in a country like Japan, discrimination or racism against non-national, non-ethnic Japanese people are somehow allowed or somehow taken for granted, somehow not criticized enough.
Thank you. As a follow-up to Yuko's point about national education, Joseph, do you think that history and the teaching of history in some countries is a form of non-violent hostilities? How does it influence this sense of race, for example, of natives versus settlers, or of residents versus immigrants?
That's a very good question. And I think, as with anything else, education can be very easily politicized. Yeah, and particular versions of history prioritized compared to others. So if I can use the case again of Malaysia, where there are history books that the way they describe the ethnic Chinese and as pendatang, for example, and how this idea resonates and continues on and just flows off the tongue of not just politicians, but in many respects in popular discussions about it. That ethnic Chinese are not part of the Malaysian state, and the problem is that the state itself, there's no shall we say effort or real will to restrain that kind of discourse. It becomes normalized in Malaysia. And just to end, I give you another very interesting example. Again, from the Malaysian case, I get quite excited when talking about this. The concept of Masuk Melayu. Yeah, very interesting concept in Malaysia. That is to become a Malay. Now, one important aspect of it in today's Malaysian society is religion. Yeah, you're supposed to be able to speak the language, practice the culture, but also be a Muslim. Yeah, these are sort of the three pillars of Malay identity. There's a very interesting discussion with relation to how ethnic Indians can masuk Melayu, can become a Malay, even though they are not ethnically Malay. But there isn't such a discussion, or certainly not to such extent, with regards to ethnic Chinese who do speak Malay, who do, those who embrace are prepared to embrace the Islamic religion, who speak Malay, who want to sort of, embrace the culture and norms of Malay, but historically they are ethnically Chinese. They are left outside this discussion. Very different from the Indians. And I think a lot of it, again, has to do with history and has to do with education and how this particular ethnic group has been portrayed.
Well, we could carry on for another half an hour, but I see that lunch is already being served. So since we come between you and lunch, I will have to call this session to an end. Thank you to the panel, and will you join me in appreciating?